Jake Morrison had been flying patrol missions for 3 years, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. His small ship called the Defiant moved slowly through the dark space near Proxima Station, while he checked his instruments one more time. The readings showed everything was normal, but something felt wrong. The silence was too complete, and the emptiness around him seemed to press against his ship like a living thing. He had volunteered for this mission because someone needed to check the outer rim for enemy activity. Earth's defense force was stretched thin, and every pilot who could handle a reconnaissance vessel was needed. Jake knew the risks, but he also knew that humanity's survival depended on gathering intelligence about the aliens who had recently appeared in their sector. The Zephyrian Empire had made contact with Earth 6 months ago, and their message had been simple: submit to their rule or face destruction. Their ships were massive crystalline structures that moved through space with grace and speed that human technology could not match. Their weapons could cut through Earth's strongest shields like paper, and their tactics had defeated every other species they had encountered. Jake's scanner suddenly lit up with warning signals. 3 large shapes materialized from hyperspace directly in front of his position. The Zephyrian cruisers were beautiful in a terrifying way, with their smooth surfaces that seemed to bend light around them. Each ship was 10 times larger than his vessel and armed with weapons that could destroy entire planets. He immediately sent a distress signal toward Earth and prepared to run. His ship's engines roared to life as he turned away from the enemy vessels, but it was already too late. Beams of pure energy struck his shields and overloaded his power systems within seconds. The Defiant shuddered and began to lose altitude. As its engines failed one by one, Jake's crew of 4 tried desperately to restore power, but the damage was too severe. Lieutenant Susan Walsh worked frantically at the engineering console while Sergeant Bob Miller attempted to get the weapons online. Corporal Lisa Brown monitored communications, and Private Dan Clark managed the life support systems. They all knew their chances of survival were almost zero, but they kept working anyway. The first Zephyrian beam that penetrated their shields killed Susan instantly. The second beam tore through the ship's hull and created a massive hole in the cargo bay. Bob and Lisa died when the third beam struck the bridge directly. Don lasted a few more seconds before the fourth beam finished what the others had started. Jake found himself alone on a ship that was breaking apart around him. Emergency systems were failing, and the air was being sucked out through dozens of holes in the hull. He had maybe 2 minutes before the ship exploded or the vacuum of space killed him. The escape pod was his only chance, but even that seemed hopeless against 3 enemy cruisers. He crawled through the wreckage to reach the pod, while debris floated around him in the zero gravity. His hands were bleeding from sharp metal edges, and his head was pounding from a blow he had taken when the bridge exploded. The pod's door opened with a hiss, and he threw himself inside just as another beam struck the ship's reactor core. The explosion threw the pod away from the dying ship like a cork from a bottle. Jake was unconscious when the Zephyrian tractor beam caught his pod and pulled it toward the nearest cruiser. He did not see the aliens who opened his pod or feel their strange hands examining his body. His last memory was of his crew dying around him and the sound of his ship being torn apart when the Zephyrians found him floating in the damaged pod. They were curious about this new species. They had heard reports about humans from their scouts, but had never captured one alive. The creature was smaller than they expected and seemed fragile compared to the other species they had conquered. His skin was soft and his bones appeared weak, but something about his face suggested a stubborn intelligence. Admiral Kethron studied the unconscious human with cold interest. He was tall even for a Zephyrian, with translucent skin that showed the flow of energy through his body. His mind could process information faster than any human computer, and his memory contained the complete history of every species his people had defeated. This new specimen would provide valuable data about human psychology and pain tolerance. The medical team treated Jake's injuries just enough to keep him alive during transport to their prison world. They sealed his wounds with energy fields and injected him with drugs that would prevent infection, but they made no effort to reduce his pain. Admiral Kethron wanted the human to suffer during the journey so that the breaking process could begin. Immediately, Jake's pod was placed in a holding cell aboard the cruiser. Eternal glory. The cell was a cube of white metal with an energy barrier for a door. Inside was a sleeping platform and a waste disposal unit, but nothing else. The lighting was harsh and constant, while the temperature was kept just cold enough to be uncomfortable. Every detail had been designed to wear down a prisoner's resistance over time. Other cells held prisoners from different species that the Zephyrians had conquered over the centuries. There were the insect-like Krathari who had once ruled a dozen worlds, the plant-based Yulani who could survive in any environment, the energy beings called Nexari who had transcended physical form only to be trapped in crystalline prisons. All of them had been broken by Zephyrian methods and now served as examples of what happened to those who resisted the Empire. The journey to Neuraxis Prime took 2 weeks, during which Jake drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he woke to find Zephyrian scientists studying him through the energy barrier. They spoke about him in their musical language as if he were nothing more than an interesting animal. Their voices were beautiful, but their words carried the cold detachment of creatures who had never known defeat. When Jake finally became fully conscious, he found himself staring at a ceiling that seemed to glow with its own inner light. His body ached from his injuries, and his mouth was dry from the drugs they had given him. He could hear sounds from other cells and the distant hum of the ship's engines, but mostly there was silence. The kind of silence that came from a place where hope had been systematically destroyed over many years. He sat up slowly and looked around his cell. The walls were smooth and featureless, while the floor was warm to the touch. There was no way to tell time and no way to communicate with the outside world. He was completely alone with only his thoughts and the growing realization that he was about to face something far worse than death. Dr. Veltar had studied 47 different species in her 3 centuries of service to the Zephyrian Empire. She knew exactly how long it took to break a Krathari warrior and what frequency of sound would drive a Yulani to madness. Each species had predictable weaknesses that could be exploited with scientific precision. The human male designated as Subject 7742 would be no different from any other primitive creature she had studied. The prison complex on Neuraxis Prime was her masterpiece. Every corridor and every cell had been designed to maximize psychological pressure on the inmates. The walls were white to prevent any sense of comfort, and the lighting never changed to destroy natural sleep cycles. Temperature fluctuated randomly to keep prisoners constantly uncomfortable, while the air carried a faint chemical that increased anxiety levels. Jake Morrison had been unconscious for 6 hours when the energy barrier to his cell disappeared. 2 Zephyrian guards entered wearing armor that looked like flowing liquid metal. They moved with perfect coordination as they attached restraints to his arms and legs. The restraints were made of the same energy that formed his cell door, and they burned his skin wherever they touched. They dragged him through corridors lined with other cells containing broken prisoners from across the galaxy. Some inmates pressed against their barriers and stared at him with empty eyes. Others had retreated to corners of their cells and rocked back and forth while making soft sounds. A few had simply given up and lay motionless on their sleeping platforms. The examination room was a sphere of polished metal, with Jake suspended in the center by energy fields. Dr. Veltar floated around him on a platform that moved without any visible means of propulsion. Her translucent skin showed the flow of different colored lights that indicated her emotional state. Right now, those lights were steady and blue, which meant she was curious about her new subject. She began with basic questions about Earth's military strength and the location of human colonies. When Jake gave her only his name, rank, and service number, she activated the first level of pain induction. Energy flowed through his body like liquid fire, but he gritted his teeth and remained silent. The pain was worse than anything he had ever experienced, but he had been trained to resist. Interrogation. Dr. Veltar increased the intensity until Jake's muscles contracted involuntarily and sweat poured down his face. Still, he said nothing except to repeat his name, rank, and service number. She made notes on a device that projected holographic symbols in the air around her. This level of resistance was unusual but not unprecedented. Some species required more persuasion than others. The second day brought different torments. Sound. Waves that made his teeth ache and his bones vibrate. Lights that flashed in patterns designed to trigger seizures. Chemicals injected into his bloodstream that made his skin feel like it was crawling with insects. Between each session, Dr. Veltar would ask her questions and Jake would give the same response. On the third day, she tried gravitational manipulation. Jake's body was compressed until he could barely breathe, then stretched until his joints screamed in protest. The artificial gravity in the chamber shifted constantly, making him dizzy and nauseous. When that failed to break him, she introduced magnetic fields that interfered with his nervous system and made his muscles spasm uncontrollably. Jake discovered something during those first weeks of torture that surprised him. His body was adapting to the pain. Each session hurt less than the one before as his mind learned to disconnect from physical sensation. He began to retreat into memories of home when the torture became too intense. He thought about his childhood in Michigan and the smell of his mother's cooking. He remembered fishing with his father and the feeling of sun on his face. Dr. Veltar noticed these changes and found them fascinating. Most species broke within days of arriving at her facility. The few that lasted longer usually did so through rage or hatred, which burned out quickly. This human was different. He was not fighting the pain, but flowing around it like water around a stone. She had never seen anything like it. She decided to try psychological warfare instead of physical torture. The examination room filled with holographic images of Earth's major cities. New York with its towering buildings and millions of people. Los Angeles sprawling across the desert like a vast organism. Chicago rising from the shores of Lake Michigan, like a mountain of glass and steel. Then she showed him what would happen to those cities when the Zephyrian fleet arrived. The buildings melted under energy beams while people ran screaming through streets that burned with radioactive fire. She made the images as realistic as possible using data gathered from planets they had already conquered. Millions of deaths. Played out in perfect detail before Jake's eyes. His face remained impassive, but she could see his heart rate increase and his breathing become shallow. She was finally getting a reaction. She showed him images of human children dying in the bombardment, and women fleeing from Zephyrian soldiers. She described in detail how his people would be processed for slave labor, and how their culture would be erased from history. Jake closed his eyes and tried to block out the images, but they continued to play inside his mind. The horror was almost unbearable, but he refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing him break. He thought instead about the courage of his crew who had died trying to save their ship. He remembered Susan Walsh working at her console until the very end. He held on to their sacrifice and used it to strengthen his resolve. Dr. Veltar tried a different approach. She created false recordings of other human prisoners screaming for mercy in nearby cells. She told Jake that dozens of his people had already been captured and that they were all suffering because of his refusal to cooperate. If he would just answer a few simple questions, she could make their pain stop. Jake knew the recordings were fake because he had been the only survivor of his ship. But even if they were real, he would not have broken. His training had taught him that information given under torture was unreliable and that his duty was to resist, no matter what the cost. Every human soldier knew that some things were more important than individual survival. By the end of the second week, Dr. Veltar was forced to admit that her standard methods were not working. The human was not just resisting her torture, but actually growing stronger from it. His vital signs showed that his body was adapting to pain levels that would have killed most other species. More disturbing was the fact that his psychological profile remained stable despite weeks of intensive pressure. She began to study him not as a test subject, but as a puzzle that needed to be solved. What she discovered about human psychology would soon change everything she thought she knew about the nature of intelligence and survival. Lieutenant Amy Carter had been tracking the Zephyrian fleet through deep space for 3 months without being detected. Her ship, the Wraith, was the most advanced stealth vessel that Earth had ever built, but it was still primitive compared to alien technology. Every day she risked discovery, and every night she dreamed of the mission that had brought her so far from home. She was Earth's best special operations officer with skills that had been honed through years of dangerous missions. Amy could speak 12 languages and had trained in combat techniques from around the world. She understood alien psychology better than most humans and had studied Zephyrian culture until she could predict their behavior patterns. This mission was the most important of her career, and failure would mean the end of her species. The Zephyrian patrol routes had taken months to memorize, but Amy knew them better than the aliens themselves. She had watched their ships move through hyperspace jumps and learned to predict where they would appear next. Their communication frequencies were encrypted, but she had broken enough of their codes to understand basic tactical information. Most importantly, she had learned how to forge their identification signals. When her sensors detected the massive prison complex on Neuraxis Prime, she knew she had found something significant. The facility was surrounded by defensive platforms and energy shields that could stop a full military assault. Thousands of ships from dozens of species were held in the facility's docking bays like trophies of conquest. The energy signatures suggested that the complex held prisoners from across the galaxy. Amy's mission was to gather intelligence about Zephyrian technology and return to Earth with information that could help humanity survive the coming war. She was not supposed to take unnecessary risks or attempt any rescue operations. Her orders were clear, and her duty was to her entire species, not to individual prisoners who might be held in enemy facilities. But when her deep scan sensors detected a faint human life sign somewhere in the complex, she felt her resolve weaken. The signature was weak and distorted, but it was definitely human. Someone from Earth was being held prisoner in that facility, and they were probably suffering unimaginable torment. Amy stared at the readout for a long time before making a decision that would change everything. She spent 3 days studying the prison complex and planning her infiltration. The facility had 6 levels with the most dangerous prisoners held in the deepest sections. Guard rotations followed predictable patterns, and shift changes created brief windows of opportunity. The experimental wing was heavily secured, but not impossible to reach for someone with Amy's skills. The stolen Zephyrian uniform fit her perfectly after some modifications. She had killed the uniform's original owner during a supply run and taken his identification codes along with his body. The forged credentials would not stand up to detailed scrutiny, but they should be enough to get her past routine security checks. She practiced walking like a Zephyrian and speaking their language with the proper accent. Her infiltration began at the facility's main docking bay, where supply ships arrived twice daily. Amy's modified shuttle looked like a standard cargo vessel, and her false manifest showed routine deliveries of food and medical supplies. The docking bay guards were bored and careless after years of handling peaceful supply runs. They barely glanced at her papers before waving her through. The corridors inside the complex were filled with the sounds of suffering. Screams echoed from cells where prisoners were being tortured while others begged for mercy in languages Amy did not recognize. The smell of fear and desperation hung in the air like a toxic fog. She had seen horrible things during her military career, but nothing had prepared her for the systematic cruelty of this place. She made her way deeper into the facility, using maintenance tunnels and service corridors to avoid the main guard posts. Her stolen uniform and forged identification got her past several security checkpoints, but she could feel the tension building with each level she descended. The experimental wing was in the deepest part of the complex, where the most valuable prisoners were held. Amy found him in a spherical chamber, suspended in an energy field that made his body glow with painful light. Jake Morrison hung there like a broken doll, while Zephyrian scientists monitored his vital signs on holographic displays. His body was covered with burns and cuts, but his eyes still held the fierce determination that had kept him alive through weeks of torture. Dr. Veltar floated around him on her platform while making notes about his responses to different stimuli. She spoke about Jake as if he were nothing more than an interesting specimen rather than a living being with thoughts and feelings. Her casual cruelty was worse than outright hatred because it showed how little she valued human life. Amy watched from the shadows as another torture session began. Energy flowed through Jake's body while he gritted his teeth and refused to scream. The pain was obviously terrible, but he endured it without breaking. She could see the admiration in Dr. Veltar's eyes as she observed his resistance. The alien scientist was fascinated by human endurance in the same way a researcher might study an unusual laboratory animal. The session lasted for 2 hours before Dr. Veltar finally stopped and returned Jake to his cell. Amy followed at a distance and memorized the route through the experimental wing. She counted the number of guards and noted their patrol patterns. The security was heavy but not impossible to overcome with the right approach and timing. She spent the rest of the day studying the facility's layout and planning her rescue attempt. The logical part of her mind said that saving one prisoner was not worth risking her mission. Earth needed the intelligence she had gathered, and her death would serve no useful purpose. But the human part of her could not abandon a fellow soldier who had endured so much without breaking. That night, Amy made her way back to the experimental wing carrying stolen weapons and explosives. She had studied the facility's power systems and identified the weak points that could be exploited. Her plan was risky and would probably end in her death, but she could not live with herself if she left Jake to suffer alone. She thought about her childhood in Texas and the values her parents had taught her. Never leave a fallen comrade behind. Never give up when people are counting on you. Never let evil triumph through inaction. These were the principles that had guided her entire life, and they would guide her now, even if it meant sacrificing everything she had worked to achieve. The rescue would begin in 4 hours, when the guard shifts changed and the facility's defenses were at their weakest. Amy checked her weapons one final time and prepared to discover what humans were truly capable of when pushed beyond their limits. Amy Carter moved through the maintenance tunnels beneath the prison complex like a ghost in the darkness. Her stolen explosives were attached to the main power conduits that fed energy to the facility's most critical systems. She had studied Zephyrian engineering for months and knew exactly where to place each charge for maximum effect. The aliens had built their prison to be escape-proof, but they had never planned for someone who understood their technology better than they did. The first explosion came at exactly midnight when the guard shifts were changing. The blast tore through the primary power coupling and sent cascading failures throughout the facility's energy grid. Emergency lighting flickered on, but half the systems remained dead. Containment fields that had held prisoners for decades suddenly vanished, and thousands of inmates found themselves free for the first time in years. Amy had timed everything perfectly. The backup generators would take 3 minutes to fully activate, and the security systems would need another 2 minutes to reset. That gave her 5 minutes to reach Jake's cell and get him out before the facility could respond. She ran through corridors filled with confused guards and liberated prisoners while explosions echoed through the complex. The experimental wing was in chaos. When she arrived, Dr. Veltar was frantically trying to activate manual controls while her assistants struggled with equipment that no longer responded to their commands. The energy field around Jake's cell had disappeared, and he was already pulling himself free from the restraints that had held him suspended for weeks. Amy burst into the chamber with her weapon raised and immediately shot the 2 guards who tried to stop her. The Zephyrian energy weapon felt strange in her hands, but she had practiced with captured alien technology until she could use it as well as any human rifle. The beam cut through their armor like it was made of paper, and both guards dropped to the floor. Jake was weak from his ordeal, but his eyes blazed with fury when he saw the opportunity for revenge. Amy tossed him a spare weapon and watched him catch it with hands that shook from exhaustion but still gripped the unfamiliar device with deadly purpose. He had been tortured for weeks, but the fire inside him had never been extinguished. Dr. Veltar tried to retreat to her laboratory, but Jake was faster despite his injuries. He cornered her against a wall of equipment and pressed the weapon against her translucent throat. The alien scientist, who had studied him like a laboratory animal, now trembled with fear as she realized that the specimen had become the predator. Amy wanted to tell him to kill her quickly so they could escape, but she saw something in Jake's eyes that made her pause. This was not just about revenge or even survival. This was about showing these aliens that humans were not laboratory animals to be studied and discarded. Dr. Veltar had learned about human pain tolerance, but now she would learn about human justice. Jake spoke to her in English, knowing that she had learned his language during their sessions together. He told her exactly what he thought of her scientific methods and her casual cruelty. He described what would happen to her species when humanity came looking for revenge. His words were quiet but filled with a promise that made the alien scientists' lights flicker with terror. The facility's alarm systems finally came online and filled the corridors with wailing sounds that hurt human ears. Amy knew they had maybe 2 minutes before security forces would surround the experimental wing. She grabbed Jake's arm and pulled him toward the exit, but he was not finished with. Dr. Veltar, the alien scientist, died slowly as Jake demonstrated some of the techniques she had used on him. Amy watched without intervening because she understood that this was necessary. The Zephyrians needed to learn that humans were not passive victims who would accept torture without consequences. They needed to understand that every act of cruelty would be repaid with interest. Other prisoners had heard the explosions and were breaking out of their cells throughout the complex. The Krathari warriors who had been broken by years of captivity suddenly remembered how to fight. The Ulani plant beings used their natural abilities to strangle guards with vine-like appendages. Even the energy-based Nexari found ways to strike back at their captors. Amy and Jake fought their way through the facility toward the docking bay where her ship waited. The corridors were filled with running figures and the sounds of combat as centuries of oppression finally exploded into violence. Guards who had grown soft from years of easy duty found themselves facing enemies who had nothing left to lose. The human weapons training that Amy had received proved superior to anything the Zephyrians had prepared for. She moved through their ranks like a force of nature, cutting down enemies with precision and efficiency. Her combat skills had been honed by years of warfare, while theirs had been dulled by generations of easy victories against helpless prisoners. Jake fought beside her with the desperate fury of someone who had been pushed beyond all limits. His body was weak, but his spirit was unbreakable, and he used captured alien weapons with deadly effectiveness. The guards who had watched him being tortured now fell before his assault like wheat before a scythe. They reached the docking bay to find it filled with escaped prisoners trying to steal ships to escape the planet. Most of the aliens were too weak or too broken to be effective, but their presence created chaos that helped Amy and Jake reach their vessel. The Wraith was exactly where she had left it, with its stealth system still active. The ship's engines roared to life as Amy initiated the launch sequence. Jake collapsed into the co-pilot's seat while she guided them through the facility's failing defenses. The prison complex was tearing itself apart as explosions rocked the structure and fires spread through the corridors. They escaped into space just as the facility's main reactor went critical. The explosion lit up the night sky of Neuraxis, prime like a second sun, while debris scattered across the planet's surface. Thousands of prisoners died in the blast, but they died free rather than in chains. Amy set course for Earth, while Jake stared at the destruction behind them. He had survived weeks of torture that would have broken most people, but the real test was just beginning. The intelligence they had gathered would change the course of the war, but the Zephyrians would learn that humans were far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The galaxy was about to discover what happened when you tried to break a species that refused to stay broken. The destruction of Neuraxis Prime sent shock waves through the Zephyrian empire that reached every corner of their territory within days. For 3,000 years they had ruled the galaxy through fear and technological superiority, but now one of their most secure facilities had been destroyed by prisoners they considered primitive animals. The news spread through their communication networks like a virus carrying a message that terrified the ruling class. Admiral Kethrin stood in his command center aboard the flagship Eternal Dominion, staring at holographic displays that showed the complete devastation of the prison complex. Satellite images revealed nothing but a smoking crater where the facility had once stood. The explosion had been so powerful that it created a new canyon in the planet's surface and scattered debris across 3 continents. He had built his reputation on breaking enemy spirits through calculated cruelty, but now his methods had backfired in the worst possible way. The human specimen that was supposed to demonstrate the futility of resistance had instead become a symbol of defiance that inspired rebellion throughout the galaxy. Species that had accepted Zephyrian rule for centuries were suddenly questioning why they submitted to alien masters. The intelligence that Amy and Jake brought back to Earth changed everything about humanity's approach to the war. Earth's military leaders studied the captured data with growing excitement as they realized that Zephyrian technology was not as advanced as it appeared. Their weapons were powerful but predictable, while their tactics relied on psychological intimidation rather than superior strategy. General Patricia Stone commanded Earth's defense forces, and she understood immediately what the intelligence meant. The Zephyrians had grown soft during their long period of dominance and had never faced an enemy that refused to surrender. Their entire military doctrine was based on quick victories achieved through overwhelming displays of force, followed by the submission of defeated enemies. Humans did not surrender easily, and they certainly did not stay defeated once they learned how to fight back. Earth's engineers began reverse engineering captured Zephyrian technology, while military strategists developed new tactics based on human strengths rather than trying to match alien capabilities. The war that followed would be unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The first human raids began 6 months after Jake and Amy's escape. Small teams of Special Forces soldiers infiltrated Zephyrian installations across their territory using stolen ships and forged identification codes. They struck military bases, manufacturing facilities, and communication centers with precision and violence that shocked their enemies. Captain Ryan Davis led one such team in an assault on a weapons factory in the Kepler system. His squad of 12 soldiers destroyed the facility's defenses, killed every Zephyrian they encountered, and escaped with valuable technology before reinforcements could arrive. The attack lasted only 4 hours, but it demonstrated that humans could strike anywhere in Zephyrian space. Lieutenant Sarah Kim's team hit a communication relay station that controlled Zephyrian fleet movements in an entire sector. They not only destroyed the facility, but also transmitted false orders that sent enemy ships to empty systems where they waited for battles that never came. The confusion lasted for weeks and allowed human forces to attack undefended targets throughout the region. Admiral Kethrin found himself hunting ghosts as human strike teams appeared and disappeared like shadows. His elegant strategies that had defeated dozens of species proved useless against enemies who fought with desperate creativity. Every time he thought he had cornered a human unit, they would vanish only to reappear somewhere else days later. The Zephyrian Empire began to fracture as their subject species saw that the supposedly invincible masters could be defeated. The Krathari remembered their warrior heritage and began attacking Zephyrian garrisons on their homeworld. The Ulani used their plant-based biology to poison water supplies on occupied planets. Even the peaceful Nexari found ways to disrupt Zephyrian energy systems. What terrified the Zephyrians most was not the military defeats, but the realization that humans fought for reasons they could not understand. Other species had surrendered when faced with the choice between submission and extinction, but humans seemed willing to die for abstract concepts like freedom and dignity. They could not be broken because they valued something more than their own survival. Dr. Veltar's research notes became required reading for every Zephyrian military commander, but the information only made them more afraid. Her detailed observations of human psychology revealed a species that grew stronger under pressure rather than weaker. Physical torture increased their resistance, while psychological warfare only deepened their hatred. The war reached its climax when human forces cornered Admiral Kethrin on an asteroid base in the outer rim of Zephyrian territory. His fleet had been systematically destroyed over 2 years of running battles, and he was down to a single ship with a crew that no longer believed in Zephyrian superiority. The elegant admiral who had once broken entire civilizations now hid in a mining facility waiting for death. Amy Carter found him in the base's command center, trying to send a final message to his superiors. She had hunted him across the galaxy using the same patience and skill that had allowed her to infiltrate Neuraxis Prime. The weapons in her hands were human-made, but they fired with the fury of every prisoner who had suffered in Zephyrian cells. Catherine tried to maintain his dignity as she approached, but his translucent skin showed the fear that coursed through his body like poison. He had studied human psychology enough to know that mercy was not something he could expect. These creatures did not forgive those who had tortured their people, and they certainly did not forget. Amy spoke to him in his own language, telling him exactly why he was going to die. She described the screams of human prisoners in his facilities and the tears of families who would never see their loved ones again. She explained how his casual cruelty had awakened something in humanity that would hunt his species to the ends of the galaxy. The shot that killed Admiral Catherine echoed through the command center and marked the end of the Zephyrian Empire. His death was broadcast across human communication networks and celebrated on 1,000 worlds. The elegant alien who had believed in his people's superiority died alone and afraid, just like the countless prisoners who had suffered in his facilities. The galaxy that emerged from the war was very different from the one that had existed before. Humanity took its place among the stars, not as conquerors but as liberators who had proven that no species was destined to rule over others. The Zephyrian Empire collapsed into civil war while their former subjects built new civilizations based on cooperation rather than domination. Jake Morrison and Amy Carter became legends whose names were spoken with reverence on worlds they had never visited. But they knew the truth that their admirers could never fully understand. They had not won through superior technology or advanced tactics, but through something far more powerful. They had won because they were human, and humans never gave up when fighting for their freedom.